I'm honoured to introduce Linda, someone who is if you know of Linda's work, then you know she's fantastic. More people need to know about her. I know Linda through the patterns community. If you look into Agile, look into the history of Agile, the roots are all in the patterns community. Linda's written several books about patterns, most recently More Fearless Change. She follows on from Fearless Change, books about change. They're well worth looking at, well worth reading. And I think she might have something to say about that here.
Yeah, maybe so. Thank you. Something about this reminds me of an airplane. You're all jammed in uncomfortable seats and we're having a late takeoff. And someone has just said, oh, well, we'll make up the time somehow. We'll get there on time. I don't know. So I'll try to speak faster. Can you hear me on the back? Is it okay? Oh, and you poor people are sitting there in the sun. Yeah, all right. So the first slide is really one of the most important because it has my contact information. I will be here for the next 2 days of the conference. But if you want to send me some email, it's linda@lindarising.org. And if, when you finish with the presentation and you think, I wish someone in my office or someone in my family had been here to hear the talk, send me some email and I will send you the PowerPoint. There's no copyright on any of it. You can change it up and give the presentation to fit your needs. And that's true for any of my talks. So if you hear me on YouTube and you say, well, I really like that talk, I want to give it, so I will send you the PowerPoint. All right, let's take a little survey. Obviously, you're Agile enthusiasts. How many of you are doing some flavor of Agile? I would ask you exactly. Okay, almost everybody. How did you make that decision? Did you look at all of the randomized, controlled, double-blind studies that clearly showed that Agile is much better than whatever it was that you were doing before? How many of you looked at all of those scientific studies that showed that Agile? All right, at least you're honest, except for this gentleman right here, because there aren't any. There are none. We don't do science in this business. We like to think of ourselves as scientists somehow tied to a scientific profession, I guess, but we don't do science in our decision making. Probably you made the decision to go Agile because you heard some good stories. You heard about other companies that were doing Agile. Well, we do tell a lot of good stories. They're not even really case studies because that does count, I guess, sort of almost scientific. We call them experience reports. I will tell you what I did, and then you will hear that story, and you will say, oh, they did this, and so therefore, that sounds like a good idea, so why don't we all do it? Is that how you did it, somehow? Maybe you didn't make the decision, someone else in your organization made that decision, some higher level individual made that decision, but it was not based on science, it was based on stories. Yeah, there we go. So that's what we've been doing since the business began. Now science has been around at least that long, but we haven't really brought it in to our decision making. We don't really use science in order to make our decisions. We just pass around good stories. And one of the good news things is that stories are very convincing. In fact, if you want to influence somebody, the best thing you can do is tell them a good story. What we know about evidence is that it is not convincing. If someone disagrees with you and you think you're going to inform them or influence them by showing them data, what we know is that that will just simply move them into their corner of the world more firmly. It's the backlash effect. So stories convince. data does not. And yet we spend a lot of time gathering data. We think that that is the way to convince a lot of people. Science, on one hand, hasn't been around very long, and it can't be used to convince people. It's only a few hundred years old, whereas we've been telling stories, and we are hardwired to listen to stories. It's the way we've been operating and making decisions for tens of thousands of years. And one of the amazing things is you put someone in an MRI machine, and you present data and then tell them a story, you can actually see the different parts of the brain light up in response to those two kinds of input. We are much more responsive. Lots of areas of our brain light up when we hear a good story. Whereas when we look at evidence, data, scientific studies, we really don't pay much attention. Well, I get a lot of pushback when I talk about things like this. Someone once told me in a setting like this, but Linda, why would we need to test? Look at all of these practices that Agile espouses. Surely this is just common sense. Would you need evidence for something that is common sense? And maybe that's what you're thinking. So I'm going to tell you a story about a related field that we think of as scientific, and that's the field of medicine. So most of us who spend any time visiting a doctor, at least once a year maybe for a checkup, like to think that the doctors are making decisions based on science. But if you look at the history of medicine, what you find is that for a lot of it, most of the practices, well, were not very agile, and they were simply passed around in the form of a good story. And one of the most prevalent that stayed with medicine for over 2,000 years was the practice of using leeches. I don't know whether there are any in Cornwall or not. Can you see that guy? Leeches were so popular as a means of treatment for anything, colds, cancer, headaches, that they nearly went extinct. Was passed around as best practice around the globe for over 2,000 years. Now, if you had decided to question that practice by saying, I'd like to see some evidence for this, that on the one hand, people who are treated with leeches get better or improve, those who don't, let's run a real scientific trial, you would have been booed out of the room as a heretic because everyone said this is just common sense. We all know we're made up of 4 humors, and if you're sick, well, that means one of them is out of balance. So applying a leech is the perfect thing to do. It's a way of solving any one of your problems in imbalance, even in the face of people who died under the treatment. One of them was a pretty famous president of the United States. In fact, the very first president, George Washington, died because of this practice. It took a long time before a fellow named William Harvey said, I'm going to do those scientific experiments. And he showed in 1628 that bloodletting was not efficacious. So you would think that people who practice medicine, doctors, would look at this evidence and be convinced, saying, a famous scientist tells us that this practice doesn't work. So therefore, logically, therefore we should stop doing it. Wouldn't you think that? Oh, come on, you're not asleep yet, are you? Wouldn't you think that? Sure, of course they would. What you find is that scientists, whether doctors or scientists or not, that's up for debate, but even scientists will look at evidence and say, I'm not so sure. And in fact, what the data shows is that we were still practicing bloodletting until the 1920s. It only took 300 years for the evidence to really impact the field of medicine. So what we know is that the stories people were telling themselves were more powerful. I hate to use the word Trump. I was in Budapest a few years ago, and one of the points for me of staying long enough to see some of the sites was to visit the grave of Ignaz Semmelweis. I'm sure you've all heard of Ignaz. All right, 2 people. Thank you very much. So Ignaz is an interesting guy. He was Hungarian, but he practiced medicine in Vienna. And he noticed something very strange, that when women delivered babies in that hospital, they either were attended by doctors or midwives, nurses. And he noticed the death rate was significantly different. Many more women were dying of what's called childbed fever. Many more women were dying in the ward attended by physicians. Nearly 10 times than if they delivered babies where they were attended by midwives or nurses. And so, like a good scientist, he wondered what sort of test could he make to see what the difference was. And so he observed, and he saw that the doctors began their day, every day, by performing autopsies on the women who had died the day before. And they went immediately from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands. In fact, it was a badge of honor to come into the ward covered with blood and tissue from the autopsy. So he wondered, could the doctors be bringing in, he called them cadaver particles, could the doctors be bringing in something that was causing the mothers to die? So he suggested an experiment. Let's have the doctors wash their hands. He provided basins of chlorine water, suggested that the doctors wash their hands, and then measured to see whether it had an effect on the death rate. And dramatically, even in a short period of time, it did. And he believed, therefore, that he could convince the doctors with science by saying, look, if you wash your hands, fewer women will die. I don't know exactly why, but I think somehow you're bringing in something that's causing the deaths of these mothers. And the doctors said, just as the doctors who listened to Harvey said, what are you talking about? This takes so much time. I'm a busy guy. I'm not going to wash my hands every day when I come in for performing autopsies. Now, if I had been there, I could have introduced Ignaz to a wonderful book called Fearless Change, Patterns for Introducing. And I would have suggested to him that maybe he could have used some of those patterns to convince the doctors. But no, he thought all he had to do was logically argue based on evidence. Have you ever tried that? To convince other people? Logically argue based on, how is that working for you? Not so well. And it didn't work for Ignaz either. He died in an insane asylum, still raving, you people, I'm trying to tell you, I have evidence here. And they put him in a pauper's grave. It wasn't until years later they dug him up, or how did they know it was really him? I don't know. And now he's in a nice, well, actually he's in a brick wall. His grave. Because now we know he was the first to realize not only those doctors who were performing autopsies, but other doctors as well. We still struggle with this. Doctors, probably not in the UK, but in other countries, struggle with doctors who refuse to wash their hands. Well, over time, remember it only took 300 years to get rid of leeches. Over time, doctors began to realize, yes, there were things not called cadaver particles. Someone identified them as germs. And now we have other famous scientists who can actually see those with a microscope. And gradually, all of the Western world began to be convinced that there were germs. They do live on your hands. You can't necessarily see them. They did become convinced that they should wash their hands everywhere, except in the United States. I don't know how many of you know this gentleman, James Garfield. He was the 20th president of the United States, a rather unusual politician. He was intelligent. And he was well liked by both sides of the house, as we say. He might have done great things, but unfortunately he was assassinated. And he was assassinated in a train station, not surrounded by security. That's not what they did at the time. But apparently he did have one enemy, and that one enemy appeared from behind one of the columns in the train station and pulled a gun and shot the president. Bang! He fell to the ground. He shot him again. Bang! Immediately, all of the physicians, well, there were no security, but plenty of physicians, immediately the physicians rushed to the president and said, we've got to remove the bullet. Again, best practice at the time. So the first physician on call pulled out his bag, pulled out a long, unsterilized probe, and began to immediately dig a hole in the president's back where the bullet had entered, trying, with a good heart, trying to remove the bullet and save the president's life. So that was in July. From July to September, a series of physicians, all with different approaches, including not a physician, but Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, also visited the president trying to remove the bullet. They were convinced it was on the president's right side. If they could just remove it, it would solve everything. And of course what they did was cause massive infection that spread throughout the president's body. By the time he died, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't open his mouth. Every cavity was full of infection. When he died, they did perform an autopsy, and at least the dozen or so physicians in attendance gathered around the president's body and said, "Gentlemen, we have killed the president." They could see that he had died not from the bullet wound, which was really lodged on the president's left side, nicely encapsulated. Probably could have lived with that bullet for a nice long time. But the rest of the body was full of infection, caused by the constant probing and examination of dozens and dozens of physicians. And at that point, in the United States, medicine said, now we believe. It wasn't all of the work of scientists. It was the story of the death of President Garfield. It was blown up in newspapers across the country. That's what turned the tide for medicine. You know, you might think, well, drug companies, they're pretty scientific. That's related to medicine. I suppose drug companies operated the way we do. I'm not going to ask for a survey here, but, you know, some people buy drugs on the street corner. And it's, you know, hey, I've been trying these blue pills. They really work for me. Would you like to try them? That's really how we operate, isn't it? Well, even drug companies didn't have it all figured out. they do science, they got a thing called a control group, so they don't get anything. And then you've got the group that gets the real medication. It could be anything, really. It could be a pill, it could be an injection, it could even be surgery. And now we'll watch, and we'll see if these people get better. And what they discovered is that even after a while, people on the real drug, they weren't getting better at the rate they expected. And they said, you know, something is going on in these drug trials. We need something else. We need another group. So they added a third, it's called an arm, a third arm. So we have control, we have real treatment, and now this third arm is called placebo. Have you heard of that? Why does that work? Because what they found is the people who get placebo, that's something that looks like the real drug. It'll be a tablet or a capsule or placebo surgery. It'll look like the real thing, but it won't be the real thing. But they get better. Why is that? What's the key? Yeah, it's a good story. It's that they believe. They believe in it. They don't know. The people who were in the drug trial, they don't know what they're getting. I mean, obviously the people in the control group know they're not getting any drug treatment at all. But the placebo arm and the real arm, they don't know whether they're getting the real drug or not. In fact, at the end of the trial, people are always told, you were on placebo, or you were on the real drug. And people in the placebo group will say, no, I got the real drug, I did. I got the real surgery. I got the real tablet. I feel better. It's called belief. They believe in it. And in fact, if we knew more about how that worked, we might not need so many real drugs. Unfortunately, we don't really understand it. So in the absence of science, that's kind of what we fall back on. I wonder, I do have a talk called, could Agile be a placebo? I don't get much call for it. I don't know why. But in the absence of scientific evidence, could it be that the reason why it seems to work so well is there's something about it, the stories we tell, something about it that really grabs a hold of us, and we sign up for that. We believe it. In fact, we talk about belief. And we even have high priests. We have followers. And could it be that when it doesn't work, it's not to do with the practices themselves, but it's to do with the fact they don't believe in it? Because what we know about even real drugs is if you don't believe in it, they don't have the efficacy that they do when you believe in them. You can somehow turn off the action of a real drug. So if you can do that for a drug, a chemical that you put in your body, could we do that for a software development process? Well, yeah, I think so. So we don't have any science. What we know is science makes mistakes as well. We have to change our mind. Science isn't about being perfectly true all the time. It's also not about telling stories, because that's how Einstein began. He would tell a story to a colleague. Suppose you were standing on a spaceship going at the speed of light and you decided to drop a tennis ball, and then, well, he didn't do that experiment. He was just talking about it. So there's stories in science as well. We also know scientists are biased. And they believe in something. When scientists strongly believe in something, they can override all the data in the world. not just those doctors who didn't pay any attention to leeches or Semmelweis's experiments, but scientists in other areas have been known to carry on their research because they believed in its efficacy and refused to look at information. In fact, usually science only makes progress when the old guard dies. Now there are no believers. We're seeing that now in economics. Classical economics, which is what I studied, is slowly dying. It's being replaced by behavioral economics, but it won't fully happen, that transition, until all those classical economists, and the University of Chicago is full of them, that won't happen until they die. Well, this is how we started out. We were very scientific. We were doing experiments all the time. I don't know whether this will work, but let me try it. I'll take a little step, and if I fall down, I'll learn something from that. And that will inform my next little step, and then and in fact, if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be walking, we wouldn't be talking. I don't know, we lost it. It had something to do with school. We had to go to school, and they put us in an environment. Actually, you're still in that environment. It's you sit still, you pay attention, and I will talk, and then you'll remember what I say, and I don't want to scare you. There is no quiz today, no quiz, but at the end, I want to give you a test. And so now it's not about falling down and learning from your experience. It's about you pay attention, and then I will test to see whether you really did a good job of that. And that's what learning has become. And that's the problem with stories. You think now you're in learning mode, and that means you listen. And when somebody tells you something, it's your job to remember what they told and then be able to repeat it back or tell somebody else that you know. And I'm here to tell you, wake up! That is not learning. And passing on stories. That's not how we get better. So we know, unfortunately, we're stuck in organizations, most of us, and they're not geared for science. They don't like experiment. Inherent is that the idea of failure. You might try something and it might not work. Nobody wants to talk about that. They want success. They want estimates. When is this going to be done? When are we going to all be level 1 Agile or level 2? I can't even imagine what that is. When is it going to happen? I want you to sign on the dotted line as you deliver this thing for me so I can be sure that I'm making a good decision. It's sort of pretend science or making it up. No real science there, and now we've even kind of lost the story. You know, there are some parts of our organization that still do science, but it only seems to me that it has to do with Diet Coke. They're real interested in real science when it comes to saying, well, do men like Diet Coke, or is that something women like? And men like Coke Zero. They really want to know that. And they're willing to spend money on research to define the audience for Diet Coke. So they do real experiments. They do controlled, double-blind experiments. But somehow that science never makes it over to the part of the organization where we do software development. Are we not as important as Diet Coke? So what can we do? I have to leave you with a few little tips. And the first thing you can do is, yes, there are no scientific studies that show Agile is better, but there is science at the micro level. There are people who are doing little tiny things. So my first example is Lori Williams' book on pair programming. So she just looked at pair programming, but she did real science. She did experiments. So there is evidence, a lot of it. And I know many organizations struggle with pair programming, and so that's one good source of information. Look at Lori's book. There was a wonderful example of an experiment that was done by Arlo Belshi, and it was reported at an Agile conference several years ago. I'll be happy to send you that paper. He looked at pair duration, pair ring combinations. He did a little experiment within his organization. And right now, Jez Humble is doing lots of real exciting things with Lean/Agile. He's even teaching a course at the University of California, Berkeley. So you can find the materials for that course at this URL. Remember, I'll send you the slides. You don't have to write things down. So look for evidence. There is some small, tiny little there going on. Pay attention to those. So not the big picture, but little tiny pieces of it. And then outside our field, there's a lot of research going on now about how your brain works. So how many of you read Thinking Fast and Slow? Okay, hire these people. Yes. Thinking Fast and Slow, if you haven't read it, is a good summary of the basic research in behavioral economics written by the guy who created behavioral economics. And they, in their books, these books talk about decision making and how your brain works. And that's what we do. So a lot of that can be brought in. So it's real science that we can sort of take advantage of. So read Daniel Kahneman's book, anything by Dan Ariely. And then recently there was a study done by a professor at Harvard Business Review called Teresa Amabile, and her book is called The Progress Principle. And in the study, she looked at developers, software developers. So we didn't do it, but somebody else did. And we should be paying attention to the evidence that does exist, even if we're not the ones who are performing it. Especially for some Agile practices. My big bone of contention is that there is so much evidence against the open workspace, and yet I go into countless companies where they say, look, we've created an open workspace. And not only that, we painted the walls red, which is the worst color, by the way. There's color research. Red is the worst. Sorry. Did you just paint it red? I know. Richard Dawkins said, you know, even if you can't do science, if you just understand what it is. So I love this. It's the mindset. It's the scientific mindset. If you just understand what double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments are about, then that informs your decision-making. You're a little more reluctant to say, wait, is that just a story? You're a little more open to the idea of trying to be as scientific as you can, even if you can't do real science. I'm a firm believer in eating food together. And this is a quote from a Nobel scientist who said, we no longer eat lunch together. So it used to be that we would gather. We would gather and we would share ideas. We would talk about our research. We would look at what we were working on and come up with new innovative approaches. And now, what do people do at lunchtime? They check their email. No one ever won a Nobel Prize for checking email. At least so far. Maybe they're going to include that category next year. I don't know. And then diversity. You make better decisions. And you look at more points of view. There's real research that shows this. Now, this research is limited. It only looked at the power of adding women to a team. Yes. However, if the team is all women, so it's not about just adding more women. It's about having people who see the world differently and sharing those ideas. Again, I'll be happy to send you this paper or any other that I reference if you can't find it. So this is what Agile has done for us. Common sense or not. It has said, you know, you can't sit down and make a 2-year plan. You can't in the beginning promise with a series of made-up estimates that you're going to deliver some product years hence, which is what we used to do all the time. At least we're going to be a little more open about it. And we're going to be a little more open about the idea that you as a user / client / customer, you don't have a clue about what you really want. And so we're going to be honest. And we're going to deliver in small, little steps. And we're going to ask at every step of the way, how are we doing? How are we doing so far? And we're going to be open to change. And that is a little bit of an experiment, isn't it? Just a little bit of a trial, a little bit of learning, a little bit like, well, that's what we did when we were babies. I don't know whether this will work. I'll take a step, and if I fall down, I'll learn from that. So it is a return to a little bit more scientific approach. So what can you do? And you should start right now. Ask the question, is this just more bloodletting? Is it the same old, same old? No proof, but this is what they're all doing. So because they're all doing it, that must be the thing to do. Well, no! It could just be like bloodletting. Is it just another good story? Where is the evidence? Where is even the attempt at evidence? And if there isn't any, maybe I could think of a way to look at some part of it. Maybe I could do a little experiment. I could test a little bit of it. And instead of just following lockstep to get to level 1 Agile or wherever you're going, then you should be skeptical and ask these questions not only about pair programming, but everything else. It's not your job just to do something because somebody else said, hey, this worked for us, so therefore let's all do it. We'll have new kinds of leeches that will be going extinct. So the real answer, of course, I hope you know, is that we're stuck with both. There's no way we can bypass storytelling. We're hardwired. Our brains love stories. Tell a good story and you're going to be very convincing. But it's about time that we had some evidence, at least the flavor, the introduction of some more science into the decision making that we had. So I wrote an article, and again, I'll be happy to send it to you for IEEE software about this. And you're going to send me some email and ask for this presentation and maybe some of the papers that are in there. And I'm even trying to finish 5 minutes early. That's the new book, More Fearless Change. Thank you for listening.